Hi everyone, and welcome back to our second video of the day, where we're going to talk about elements of poetry again, but specifically in this case, content elements of poetry. So instead of talking about the form of a poem, we're going to talk about how poets convey meaning and what they can do using things like language and word choice that relates to specifically what they're saying rather than how they're saying it. And again, there is some crossover between this and the formal elements. So we're going to talk about a few specific concepts, but the one that I want to make sure we get to, and that we'll be covering here, are simile and metaphor, which are things you've probably heard before, and these are part of a category called figurative language, and we'll talk about what that is. Really, all of these that we'll talk about today are forms of figurative language for the most part. And we'll also talk about personification, metonymy, and synecdoche. So, what are these terms and how do you use them? So, metaphor and simile are ones you may be familiar with from like a high school English class, or possibly a previous college English class. And what these are ways of describing something by comparing it to something else. Specifically, a simile is going to be comparing something to someone else using like or as, and telling you about whatever it is being compared in some way by doing that. A metaphor is going to be doing the exact same thing, but by equating them, by saying that something is something else rather than that it is like it. So simile, comparison using like or as, usually have two unlike things, but the comparison makes us see the similarity. And metaphor, comparison of two unlike things by equating them, or by saying that one is the other. So, as an example of a simile, my love is like a red, red rose. As if we're going to go with like hackneyed poetic metaphors. Very, very cliched, but there's a reason that that cliche came about. So what you're saying is that there are things about your love that are like that rose in some way. That there are similarities between these two things. And often, clearly we associate the color red with romance, hence roses with Valentine's Day. We often associate like hearts with, like flowers. We talk about how like your heart may open to something. So there are a lot of ways in which those things maybe are alike, because there are also a lot of ways in which they're different. Like presumably hearts don't have like thorny stems, and they don't die after a few days. But by comparing these two unlike things, it brings us to see the similarities between them, and based on those similarities, it makes us learn something more about the thing being compared, which in this case is my love, and what, by comparing it to a rose, we're focusing on is like it's beautiful, that it's it's red, and we associate that with passion. We think of it as being something like alive, something to be nurtured. There are a lot of things you could say about love that are not like a rose at all, and those are the things that are not being emphasized in this comparison. So something like, faithfulness is something we often associate with love, and there's not really anything faithful or not faithful about a rose, so that's something that does not make it into that comparison. So our emphasis is on those things that are similar in that comparison. Metaphor is going to be doing the exact same thing, but it is going to be equating the two things. So this will be, my love is a red, red rose. Again, working pretty much the same way. The downside and upside with the metaphor is that it is a much stronger way of saying something. Like, it's very different to say, this person is like garbage, versus this person is garbage. They're both making that comparison, telling you something about the person, but saying that they are garbage is a much stronger statement. And that can be good, and that can be bad. If you've picked a really crappy comparison, saying these two things are the same thing, equating them, is just going to drive home how shitty that comparison is. By the same token, it's going to really link those things that they do have in common. Because instead of saying it's like it, you're saying these things are equal. They are the same thing. We obviously know that's not actually the case. But for the purposes of the comparison, it does make for a stronger comparison. And again, we're using similes and metaphors all the time in everyday speech. We're often not even aware of how often we're using them. So these are something that we usually are pretty good at grasping. It's usually, like, people don't usually have too much trouble figuring out what simile and metaphor are once it's explained to them. So simile and metaphor both fall under a category called figurative language, which is opposed to literal language. Literal language is something that is objectively, factually true. So, like, I don't know, my eyes are brown. That's not making a value statement. It's just saying the truth. It's something that is literally true. If I say my eyes, or someone is the apple of my eye, again, we're conveying an idea, but we're not literally saying that this person is an apple. We're not saying that apple belongs to an eye. But we're getting at an idea of, apples are something that presumably when this piece of figurative language started, someone was staring at it, because it's beautiful, maybe because it's appetizing, I don't know. But they essentially saying they're like an apple to my eye. Obviously, if this goes into equating the two things, like saying that this person is an apple to my eye, then they're moving into metaphor territory. And it's obviously not something that is literally accurate. Like, it's not literally true. But it still has a truth to it. And that's what figurative language is really helpful for. Often we're saying things that are not literally true. Things like, my heart is broken. Like, no, the heart organ inside your chest has not physically broken into multiple pieces. But we're getting across that idea of it's as painful as if the physical organ inside your chest had broken into multiple pieces, and it feels as irreparable and like it's the end of the world and of your life. So even though it's not true, it's still saying something that kind of feels true. And that's where figurative language is really helpful. So, metaphors especially are a great example of figurative language, but they're not the only ones. And so, let's talk about personification, and then we're going to talk about metonymy and synecdoche, and all of these are forms of figurative language. Personification is treating inanimate objects and or ideas as if they were a person, or like at least some kind of, sentient being, and that they have some kind of agency and initiative. Like, obviously, a car isn't doing anything, but we often talk about it as if it is. Obviously, water isn't actually doing anything, like active. It's not, choosing to do something, but we'll often talk about it as if it is. So something like a running brook. Obviously, running is an idea that started talking about feet, and then we eventually kind of adapted it to mean things that are moving fast, because we wanted a way to talk about that, about things that don't have feet, like, say, rivers. Another kind of good example of personification is going to be, for those of you who are Michael Jackson fans, some Thriller lyrics. You try to scream, but terror takes the sound before you make it. You start to freeze as horror looks you right between the eyes. Terror is not taking anything. Horror is not looking anyone in the eyes. These are like abstract concepts. But we're getting across this idea that, you don't want these things there, but it's like there's some external force and you are helpless. So we're treating these as if they're people that can think and do things and want things, but they're not. But by saying that, we get across a particular idea about those concepts. And another good example is George Michael's Careless Whisper. I'm never gonna dance again. Guilty feet have got no rhythm. Obviously, feet can't be guilty, or really have rhythm in and of themselves, or they can be used to make rhythm. But we're getting across this idea of because I feel so guilty, I can't dance normally the way I would. Interestingly, this is also going to be an example of something else that we're going to talk about in a second. So, personification, taking those things that aren't actually a person or a sentient being and treating them as if they are. And finally, we have metonymy and synecdoche. And I'm going to spell these out because they're not necessarily spelled the way you'd expect. Metonymy is M-E-T-O-N-Y-M-Y. It's not that far off. Synecdoche is S-Y-N-E-C-D-O-C-H-E. So it looks like it should be synecdoche. But it's not synecdoche, it's synecdoche. It's not an intuitive word in English. These are related ideas, and they both involve using something that is related to stand in for a thing it's related to. So metonymy is just going to be exactly that. To talk about something, you essentially replace it by talking about something that's related to. Synecdoche is a subcategory of metonymy, and it's where that thing that you're relating it to is actually a smaller part of the bigger thing. So as an example of metonymy, my wallet won't let me buy a new TV. Again, figurative language, your wallet isn't letting you do anything because it has no will. It can't allow anything. But you're using your wallet to stand in for the amount of money that you have, because money goes in a wallet. And so what that means is I don't have enough money to buy that new TV. That's a sweet ride. Obviously, you're talking about presumably something that can be ridden in like a car. But to talk about the car, you're talking about the ride that is associated with the car. Synecdoche is that, but with the whole standing in for the part, or the part standing in for the whole. So, nice threads. You're obviously not talking about the literal threads that make up someone's clothing. You're talking about the clothing itself. But the threads are standing in for the clothes they're a part of. Again, with cars, nice wheels. You're usually not complimenting the actual tires. You're complimenting the car as a whole and using the wheels to kind of stand in for the car in general. I'll see this a lot with sports teams. So when we say Kansas City might end up in the World Series, clearly Kansas City is not doing anything because it's, a city. But we're using the city to stand in for the sports team that is a part of the city, the Kansas City Royals. And I think you'll often sometimes see that kind of identification of a sports team with its city so much that often they'll be used kind of interchangeably when it comes to that kind of discussion. Another good example of synecdoche, I'll put it on plastic. So to refer to a credit card, we talk about the plastic that it's made out of. So these two concepts, can be really, really, I think, helpful and useful. And again, as you've probably seen from our examples, we'll often use these without even fully realizing it. So, for example, when I brought up the guilty feet have got no rhythm, that's a good example of synecdoche, where we are using the man's feet to stand in for the man himself. Because obviously the feet aren't guilty, but the man is feeling guilty. And so the feet represent the man they're attached to. Hopefully you found this helpful. There are obviously a lot more elements, both formal and content, than I can go over in this video, either of these videos. But hopefully you found these ones at least helpful, and you remember them. At the very least, do remember simile and metaphor, because those are very commonly used and very commonly talked about, even outside of like English classes. So if you can remember those at the very least, you should be good. So that is it for today's videos. I'll get these both uploaded as soon as I can, and hopefully we'll now be back to a more regular video making schedule. So I will talk to you all later. Bye!